August 1944 opened with a sense of inevitability in Western Europe. 2 months after the Allied landings in Normandy, German resistance appeared to be cracking under relentless pressure. American armored columns thundered eastward across France, villages falling one after another as General George S. Patton's Third Army advanced at a pace few believed possible. Newspapers whispered that the war might be finished by Christmas, but just beyond the rolling countryside loomed the Vosges Mountains, dark, forested, and waiting. What lay inside those woods would test the limits of courage, loyalty, and morality in ways no battlefield victory ever could. The Vosges were not merely a geographic obstacle. They were Germany's last natural shield before the Rhine. Dense forests, steep ridges, and narrow valleys made conventional assault costly and slow. Allied commanders understood that breaking this line required something more subtle than tanks and artillery. So they turned to a force built for the impossible, the Special Air Service. Living by the uncompromising motto, "Who dares wins," the SAS had already carved out a fearsome reputation in North Africa. Now, nearly 100 of its men were chosen for a mission that would send them deep behind enemy lines, where rescue was uncertain and survival far from guaranteed. The plan was deceptively simple. The SAS would parachute into eastern France, link up with local resistance groups, and disrupt German defenses ahead of Patton's advance. Rail lines would be sabotaged, communications severed, and supply routes turned into chaos. On paper, it was a perfect complement to the Allied push eastward. But war, especially behind enemy lines, rarely follows paper plans. On the night of August 12th, an advance party descended into the darkness, parachutes blooming silently above the forest canopy, unaware that the ground below had already been claimed by a far more ruthless adversary. At first, the Vosges seemed ideal. The forests offered concealment, the terrain favored ambush, and the local resistance provided shelter, food, and guidance. Small camps were established, radios crackled with coded messages, and supplies were cached among the trees. To the SAS, it felt like the opening chapter of a familiar story: bold men, hostile territory, and the promise of decisive impact. Yet even as these preparations unfolded, eyes were already watching from the shadows, tracking movements, marking villages, and assembling a response that would soon turn the forest into a trap. Unbeknownst to the SAS, they had landed in one of the most heavily policed security zones in the region. German counter-insurgency forces had spent years refining their methods on the Eastern Front, where mercy had long since been abandoned. Orders were clear, and they were carried out without hesitation. The forest that seemed to promise safety was, in truth, a killing ground patiently waiting to be activated, and once it was, there would be no distinction between soldier and civilian. Within days, subtle signs began to surface. Drop zones felt exposed, resistance couriers failed to arrive. Distant gunfire echoed where silence had reigned before. The advance party pressed on, convinced that pressure was inevitable but manageable. They did not yet realize that every step they took was being measured, recorded, and prepared for retaliation. The mission had not failed, but it had already been compromised in ways no one could yet fully grasp. And if this story is gripping so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps ensure that stories like this, stories of courage, betrayal, and hard-earned justice, reach more people who deserve to hear them. By mid-August, the forest began to close in. German patrols grew bolder. Resistance fighters disappeared. The SAS had entered the Vosges believing they were hunters, but as the news tightened silently around them, a terrifying truth was about to emerge. The enemy was not reacting anymore. He had already begun the hunt. The SAS did not know it yet, but the moment their boots touched the forest floor, they had entered territory ruled by a man who viewed mercy as weakness. Dr. Erich Isselhorst, a seasoned Gestapo officer, had been appointed head of security police along the French-German border precisely because of his experience in crushing resistance. Since 1935, he had served the Nazi state with unwavering loyalty, and on the Eastern Front, he had commanded Einsatzgruppen units whose purpose was not battle, but annihilation. Now transferred west, Isselhorst was given a single directive: eliminate all partisans and any Allied special forces operating in the Vosges. No prisoners, no exceptions. The operation he unleashed bore a chillingly festive name: Waldfest Party in the Forest. Behind the euphemism lay a campaign of systematic terror. Isselhorst commanded a brutal mix of Gestapo agents, security police, and regular army units, all coordinated to isolate, interrogate, and destroy resistance networks. Among his closest subordinates was Dr. Hans Dietrich Ernst, a man already deeply implicated in the deportation of hundreds of French Jews to Auschwitz. Together, they brought the methods of the Eastern Front into the heart of France, where torture and execution became routine tools of intelligence. Almost immediately, pressure on the SAS intensified. German patrols appeared with unsettling precision. Firefights erupted in places that had seemed secure only days earlier. Resistance fighters, brave, committed, but often poorly trained, were cut down or captured. On August 17th, the SAS suffered its first fatality. Others simply vanished, leaving behind abandoned camps and unanswered radio calls. Each disappearance deepened the unease, yet withdrawal was impossible. The mission had to continue, or so command believed. Weeks passed before Colonel Brian Franks, commanding the main SAS force, parachuted in with reinforcements. By then, the situation had deteriorated sharply. Drop zones had been compromised, German collaborators identified hiding places. Patrols were sent out and never returned. The forest no longer felt like concealment, it felt like surveillance. Every civilian contact carried risk, every movement invited attention. And yet, without local support, survival was impossible. Isselhorst's net tightened methodically. Villages were searched. Prisoners were beaten until names, locations, and rumors spilled out. Those who could not talk were simply removed from the equation. The Germans were no longer reacting to sabotage, they were anticipating it. And as losses mounted, a grim realization began to form among the SAS. This was no ordinary counter-insurgency effort. They were facing an enemy who understood clandestine warfare and was prepared to answer it with extermination. Then the wider war intervened, with devastating consequences. Patton's seemingly unstoppable advance suddenly slowed. Fuel ran short, ammunition failed to arrive. The famed Red Ball Express, the logistical artery of the Allied push, began to dry up. The rapid breakthrough the SAS had been counting on simply did not come. The Vosges remained firmly in German hands, and the men behind the lines were left exposed, unsupported, and increasingly isolated. Cut off from relief and surrounded by a tightening ring of enemy forces, the SAS found themselves trapped by events far beyond their control. What had begun as a bold effort to hasten Germany's defeat was now devolving into a desperate struggle for survival. And as Isselhorst's men closed in from every direction, the force prepared to reveal just how unforgiving it could be. By late September, the war in the Vosges had taken on a darker, more merciless character. The SAS were no longer merely evading patrols or striking at supply lines, they were fighting time itself. Ammunition dwindled, radios fell silent. The forest that had once offered concealment now echoed with the sounds of boots, dogs, and shouted orders. Yet the cruelest blows did not fall on the soldiers hiding among the trees. They fell on the civilians who had dared to help them. German retaliation followed a grim logic. The SAS depended on villages for food, shelter, and information, and Isselhorst understood that terrorizing civilians would suffocate the resistance more effectively than any firefight. Raids became routine, homes were searched. Entire communities were interrogated. Any village suspected of aiding the SAS was marked not for punishment later, but for immediate reprisal. And the people knew it. Every loaf of bread shared, every barn offered as shelter, carried a potential death sentence. On September 24th, the village of Musi became the center of that terror. German forces surrounded the area at dawn. All men between the ages of 16 and 60 were ordered out of their homes and herded together. From concealed positions in the surrounding forest, SAS troops watched helplessly as friends, hosts, and collaborators were marched away under armed guard. There was no firefight, No rescue attempt, only the unbearable knowledge that intervention would doom everyone. And as the column disappeared down the road, a single question hung in the air: would silence be enough to save them? Despite brutal interrogations, no one in Musi betrayed the SAS. The villagers endured beatings and threats, refusing to speak. Their reward was not mercy, but deportation. Nearly 1,000 men from Musi and nearby villages were transported to concentration camps Auschwitz, Dachau, and other places few would ever return from. For the SAS, the weight of that sacrifice was crushing. The mission had crossed a moral threshold. Survival now came at a cost paid by others. By early October, Colonel Brian Franks confronted the reality he had tried to avoid. The operation had stretched to 11 weeks, far longer than planned, and the forests were no longer survivable. German forces were everywhere. Resistance networks had been shattered, supplies were gone. With no prospect of relief, Franks made the hardest decision of his command. The SAS would withdraw, breaking into small groups and attempting to slip westward through enemy lines under cover of darkness. A rear guard was left behind, tasked with waiting for missing patrols and gathering stragglers. It was a decision born of loyalty, not strategy. Those men waited in the forest night after night, listening for footsteps that never came. One by one, their signals went unanswered, and then silence. When the survivors finally reached Allied lines weeks later, exhaustion gave way to reckoning. Out of nearly 100 men who had entered the Vosges, 32 SAS soldiers and one signaler were missing or confirmed captured. No official word came from the Germans. No prisoner lists, no Red Cross notifications. The forest had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only rumors and dread. And if this story matters to you, if you believe these sacrifices should never fade into silence, liking the video and subscribing helps ensure these truths are preserved and shared with others who care about history beyond victory parades. For now, the fate of the missing remained unknown. But the war was nearing its end, and with it would come questions that could no longer be ignored. In the ruins left behind, someone would soon begin to search not for glory, but for answers buried in the forest soil. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, church bells rang and crowds filled the streets in celebration. For many, it was the end of fear, occupation, and loss. But for the families of the missing SAS men, victory brought no closure, only silence. Their sons, husbands, and brothers had vanished in the forests of eastern France, and the end of the war did not explain where they had gone or why they had never returned. The first answers came not from London, but from French authorities. Near the town of Gaggenau, just across the German border, investigators uncovered a mass execution site. Bodies lay in a bomb crater, some in British uniforms. The discovery cut through months of uncertainty with brutal clarity. These men had not died in battle, they had been murdered. Colonel Brian Franks moved immediately. There would be no forgetting, no quiet acceptance. Major Bill Barkworth was assigned to the case, a man chosen for his fluency in German, his meticulous nature, and his refusal to let details slip through the cracks. Barkworth approached the investigation not with anger, but with purpose. This was not revenge, it was responsibility. At the crater site, 27 bodies were exhumed, British, American, and French. Each had been shot in the head. Identification followed slowly and painfully. Dog tags revealed Major Andy Waitley Smith, who had stayed behind with a wounded officer rather than abandon him. Dental records and personal effects confirmed others. Every name restored was a wound reopened and a lie destroyed. The truth could no longer be denied. Barkworth's work widened. Captured Gestapo files revealed operational movements in the Vosges. Survivors from the Schirmeck security camp testified to beatings, starvation, and torture. Patterns emerged: dates, locations, transport orders, all leading back to the same command structure. At its center stood Dr. Erich Isselhorst. Beside him, Dr. Hans Dietrich Ernst, already known for his role in deporting French Jews to Auschwitz. The same machinery of death had simply been redirected toward Allied soldiers. This mattered deeply. The Nazis had attempted to erase their crime by disguising murder as counter-insurgency. But Barkworth and his team refused that, framing these were not battlefield killings. They were executions of prisoners, illegal, deliberate, and systematic. The force that had concealed the crime was now giving up its secrets. As arrests followed, the narrative of the war itself shifted. This was no longer a story of daring missions gone wrong, it was evidence of moral collapse. The discipline and accountability the Allies demanded of themselves stood in stark contrast to the methods used by Isselhorst's command. Justice, though delayed, was finally catching up. In the end, the Vosges did not remain silent. The truth spoken there echoed far beyond the trees into courtrooms, records, and memory. The war ended in 1945, but responsibility did not. And for the men who never came home, justice became the final mission, one that would not fail.